Thank you, Felina. I hope you can hear me all up at the back, but thanks. It's a pleasure to have you here on such a hot day, and thank you for making the effort to come. As Felina pointed out, last year we had the International Year of Biodiversity, and most of us in the natural sciences held the floor for far too long. As you can see, we're encroaching even into this year's set of seminars and lectures, because I intend to talk to you today very much about a natural history focus, although it's fair to say that the Abrolhos is far more than that. And what I hope to do is to introduce to you a little bit about the background of the Houtman Abrolhos, touch on that very quickly, and then get more into the specific parts of the study that I've been involved with over a period of time. The Abrolhos is a remarkable set of islands which, I'm going to have troubles, aren't I? Situated off the coast in Geraldton, and God bless our wonderful Google Earth, but you can see here there are three major groups, with North Island isolated in the north, off the coast of Geraldton. Just to put it in better perspective, we can see, not too clearly, but in fact off the west coast of Western Australia, just off Geraldton, the Houtman Abrolhos lie here, and we can see this wonderful archipelago. For those of you that have been there, I hope you will enjoy some of the slides today, because they certainly excite me getting back there each time. For those of you that haven't, perhaps a trip in the near future would be a very good exercise. What's most important about the Abrolhos, though, is in fact there are a suite of three groups of islands. The Pelsart group at the southern end here, the Easter group in the middle, and the Wallaby group to the north, which is, for all intents and purposes, linked by a shallow sea depth from North Island. The point I want to draw about this bathymetric map is that these channels between the island groups are in fact about 40 metres of sea depth, and that's about the same depth there is between the mainland and the islands. So in fact, although they are isolated, they have probably been isolated from one another, as long as they have been isolated from the mainland itself. And this makes it a very exciting proposition for those of us interested in the evolutionary processes of the fauna on the islands. It would be remiss not to get to talk very briefly about why the Abrolhos are so famous, and that's because the wreck of the Batavia occurred there on the 4th of June, 1629, and it's perhaps important because that's the first European settlement of any substance that occurred for at least 2 months on that amazing archipelago. The Batavia, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner, or the replica of it, I should say, was wrecked on Morning Reef, just on where the yellow arrow is. To look at that from the air, you can see Morning Reef with a very mild day breaking there. The ship went aground on Morning Reef. Many of the stragglers managed to make it to Traders Island, and the aerial photograph that I'm on is taken from the island known as the Batavia's Graveyard, which is now called Beacon Island. Beacon Island is the site of where the museum conducted extensive archaeological surveys, and where most of the shipwrecked survivors and most of the murdered people from the mutiny were buried. So an interesting and long history, not least of which was the extrusion of a group of soldiers led under Webby Hose that was sent across to Long Island, which is now called Wallaby Island, the biggest island in the archipelago. And he established what was a fort there with his soldiers. This is the remains of the fort. And there is some conjecture about this next shot, but also this could be in one of the structures that Webby Hayes built when he was sent to Long Island, as it then was called, to look for water. Long Island, or Wallaby Island, will feature a lot in this talk because it is the largest and perhaps one of the most diverse, and I hope to show you really one of the reasons he survived so well over there with his bands of soldiers. Pelsart, who left after the wreck on the 4th of June, looked for water on the mainland, didn't find any adjacent, which is not surprising if you've seen the Kalbarri coast, and then took off for Batavia. Coming back on a ship called the Saddam, he found that in fact the mutiny had occurred, and he ended up hanging most of the mutineers on what is now called Long Island, just across the way from Beacon Island, and he took the hands off many of them. And the interesting history is all enshrined in a book called The Islands of Angry Ghosts. If you haven't read it, I would suggest a very good read. But the Batavia is the reason why most of us perhaps know the Abrolhos, but there are other reasons, and this is because it is the most southerly coral reef in the entire Indian Ocean. So not only do we have a wonderful coral growth there, but we also have a major rock lobster industry. The western rock lobster, I think about 20% or more of the produce of the rock lobster industry is got from the Abrolhos. And that first photo you saw was of Pigeon Island, some of the huts that are occupied during the rock lobster season. So rock lobsters form a hugely important economic process on the Abrolhos, not as much this year as they have the last few years because there's been a major downturn in recruitment, but that's a different story. The other reason the Abrolhos are well known is because of their seabirds. It is a wonderful place for all ornithologists. There are some 100 species of seabirds known from that particular area, and they encompass mainly long-range migrants and a very important nesting colony of many species. To just bring the islands then into focus, because the land is what I'm going to concentrate on today, there are principally two sorts of islands, although the literature will tell you there are four. But these are the old remnants of the mainland, the platform islands as they're called. This is East Wallaby Island. As you can see, a high dual platform about 30 metres high, very significant in some of the information I wish to pass on to you. It is covered with consolidated dunes, and it is underlain by important layers of siltstone, limestone and marl. It is some 900 metres deep, the underlying rock, which is tertiary origin, suggesting there was an old reef platform there prior to it being isolated during the last glaciation. So these platform islands are, in simple terms, mainland islands, parts of the mainland that have been isolated. The other type of island is the coral islands, and here is Long Island, not the one that was named by Pelsart and his team, but this is the now notified Long Island where many of the mutineers were hung. And it is what we call a coral rubble island. And if I can show you the difference, you can see that it is actually made up of tiers of coral broken pieces, and the vegetation on that is quite sparse and quite simple. If we then look again at the types of vegetation, because not all islands are the same, the coral ones that I've just mentioned, the coral rubble islands, have very limited vegetation on them, but in the main platform islands, which are representative of the mainland, these high dunes, which again I talk about constantly because we've decided that they in fact house very important populations of some species of the animals. We have a very small remnant of eucalypt woodland. It's a very low woodland, Eucalyptus aeraria. It's the only patch of woodland on an island between Shark Bay and Albany. So on that ground alone it takes on some significance. That's on East Wallaby Island. We have mangrove communities. I know mangroves occur as far south as Bustleton and Bunbury actually, but you also find remnant patches right through the Abrolhos. And they're important, not so much for the groups I'm talking about, but as nurseries for many of the fish species which occur on the Abrolhos. Perhaps best known are these low shrublands which occur on the limestone pavements on the main island, and this is a particular site on West Wallaby, which I'll come back to later, where David Pearson conducted most of his python study work in the 90s and early 2000s. And finally, the rather large areas of deep sandy soils in which we find many of the shearwaters burrowing, in fact, very important for burrowing, and that can extend, as you can see from the photograph, across quite large swathes of these big islands. Just four of the simple but yet discrete vegetation types which occur on the main islands that are of mainland origin. It's also important to notice that in fact the Abrolhos sits in the Mediterranean climate zone. In other words, it has a climate not dissimilar to Perth, far less rainfall, but it has very hot summers and warm but wet winters. And this is a picture of two of our particular habitats that we've been examining, one taken in the spring and one taken in the summer, and you can see the differences and change between the spring vegetation, where in fact some of the plant species have disappeared altogether by summer. Perhaps better exemplified by a clearer picture taken on East Wallaby on the dune formations, where you can see the greenness that occurs during the spring period, taken in mid-November, as opposed to late March, when much of the vegetation has died back. And this has a pronounced impact also on the activity patterns of many of the species. And finally, just to give you the final overview, the Abrolhos is well known now because of the changes that have been wrought on it, not just by human settlement in the current rock lobster industry, but particularly from the guano industry. This is a picture of Rat Island, the major island of the Easter group in the centre of the Abrolhos. And you can see here slabs of limestone scattered and piled high. This is how the guano hunters left it back in probably the 40s or 50s. And in fact, the island was swept. It was so rich in phosphate-rich soils. Rat Island, prior to the extraction of guano, had colonies of literally millions of seabirds nesting on it. These all disappeared largely once guano mining started, and those that didn't disappear certainly disappeared when the rats were introduced and the cats were introduced to control the rats. So in fact, Rat Island itself now is vastly disturbed. You can see the windsock of the airport in the distance, and I'll come back to that as one of the final remarks I'd like to make. The other evidence is this is on West Wallaby Island, the largest of the islands. You can see a track through here. This is one of the tramway tracks used for the smaller area of guano extraction that occurred on West Wallaby. So we have a major guano industry that has altered many of the islands dramatically. And in fact, on one of the islands that we went to, called Dry Island, we had a team of 8 of us looking for lizards. It was so depauperate in fauna, we found no lizards whatsoever. I think we looked at every rock in the whole island. So in fact, the stacking up of these platforms of limestone into little piles hasn't really assisted the reptile fauna at all, certainly none of the other invertebrate species either. Just touching quickly on birds, just to give you some indication, a bridal tern on the left, a fleshy-footed, a wedge-tailed shearwater on the right, a couple of sooty oyster catchers and gulls of 2 sorts. The islands are rich in the extreme on seabirds, a wonderful place for ornithologists to visit. Perhaps the most important, though, is Pelsard Island, and here is a picture of an absolute mass of birds which tend to nest on the southern end of Pelsard Island. A couple of my colleagues from Biota in the foreground. The nesting sites there are particular to 2 of the endemics of the Abrolhos, the knotty tern, which nests only on the Abrolhos Islands, Pelsard and Woody, I believe, but also a subspecies nests in the Seychelles. So in fact, the subspecies on the Abrolhos itself is very important. And the other endemic bird for the Abrolhos, which is probably a little bit difficult for you to see, but in fact, these are a couple of button quail, painted button quail known in the Abrolhos, a couple of chicks, which we managed to catch and release, and there they are sitting waiting for their parents to come and pick them up. They're endemic and therefore unique only to the Abrolhos. Again, most of our bird understanding is done from patterns of feather coloration and morphology. Very little is done on the genetics, and that's one of the areas which we hope in the future that the museum will conduct some work in. And finally, some of the spectacular ones, the magnificent osprey, which has a nest on East Wallaby, which has to be seen to be believed, standing there some 8 feet off the ground but built on a rock. And around that you can get a very clear indication of the sorts of food that the osprey take, a majestic bird along with the seagull, which is very common in the Abrolhos. Quickly then, going to background of mammals, here is an atypically smooth day on the way to the Abrolhos. A humpback whale and calf, which is seen in close-up, which we were fortunate enough to get near on the way, but also as adjacent to the migration route of the humpback whale, it is a home to an awful lot of the dolphins. And this is a pod of some 60 to 70 dolphins, probably bottlenose dolphins, that you can see in the channels between the islands. So a very rich place for the cetaceans, the whales and the seals, and also an important place for the sea lions. The sea lions on the Abrolhos were in great numbers until the sealers got in amongst them. They were probably used a bit by doubtless by the mutineers in the early days when they could catch them. And seals are still hauling out in the Abrolhos, and there are still some small nurseries there. These particular Australian sea lions have a face only a mother could love. The sides of battles clearly evident on this poor old male, and a picture of a calf recently finished suckling on a small nursery on Rat Island. So it is still home to a small sea lion population, and therefore it is consequently very important for the conservation of that particular group. Now to get really to the important thing, because the work I want to talk about today is very much based on the work that I've been involved with, but it could not have been involved with without a lot of assistance from my various colleagues. I'll draw your attention to the cool dude down on the left with the dark glasses. That's David Pearson from DEC, who spent a lot of time studying the carpet pythons on the wallaby group, and it's formed a major part of our understanding of carpet python biology, one of the priority species in Western Australia. Dave got me reinterested in the Abrolhos back in the late 1990s after having been there back in the late 70s on my first visit. I also draw your attention to the lady doing the pirouette on the bottom right-hand corner, Zoe Hamilton, whose work is fundamental to getting us interested in looking at the molecular profiles of the animals on the Abrolhos. And finally, my colleague Link Schmidt, who's always looking out to the sea and drinking on the left-hand side down the bottom, who is a co-conspirator in the evolutionary biology process that we're interested in looking at across the archipelago. But there have been a numerous array of people who've come out to help us. And as you can see, the scenery is not really anything to be scoffed at. It's a wonderful place to work, particularly where the weather's calm. So the first story to talk to you about is the rats. There are rats. I mentioned rats came onto Rat Island. These were the ship rats. They played havoc with a lot of the nesting birds. This delightful thing is the Abrolhos Island bush rat, a native rat that has been out on the Abrolhos since time immemorial and still exists out in the Abrolhos. The bush rats themselves are rather interesting because they are perhaps the most widespread of all the native rats in Australia. The map at the bottom shows you the 4 major subpopulations. There's the Western Australian one, there is one in South Australia, there is one up the east coast, and there's an isolated one in North Queensland. The one on the Abrolhos was actually given its own name back in 1926, so it was Rattus glauti at that stage. Subsequently, it has been subsumed and it's now called Rattus fuscipes and linked in with the other Western Australian forms. It's one of the species we intend to look at very closely with the study of genetics. So what we have done in our attempts to re-establish an understanding of the rats on the Abrolhos is to trap on East Wallaby, where the original specimen of, this is East Wallaby, sorry, and you'll see the black lines represent the areas where trapping has occurred. I started trapping there in 1977 and subsequently with Dave Pearson and Link and the biota team in the years between 2002 up to the present. And despite all of that trapping, we no longer find that particular species on East Wallaby, despite the fact that it was originally captured there. It does exist on West Wallaby in good numbers, and if I just probably put that circle together, our trap line is based very much around the settlement at Pelican Point, but our understanding of the biology of the Abrolhos rat is going to be very much predicated on our understanding of what happens on West Wallaby. So the sad story about the bush rat, as we know it in the Australian context, was first collected down around Albany and named Rattus fuscipes by a later description. It was in 1826, the population on the East Wallaby Island was called Rattus glauti and consequently has its own systematic status. Subsequent surveys in 1977, 2002 and subsequently have shown that that population now no longer exists. It was last trapped in 1967, so we now have lost the population on East Wallaby, so we'll probably never really know what the true identity of the rat on East Wallaby was. However, it still occurs on West Wallaby, and that's one of the areas that we will be investigating just to see the profile and the identity of the rat on West Wallaby and what it really is. And with the dexterous use of skeletons and skins in the museum, we hope to be able to look at the molecular profile of the now extinct East Wallaby population. The other mammal which is of significance is the Tamil wallaby. Not particularly clear, unfortunately, in that slide, but 2 collected in one trap by work done at the University of Sydney. Just to draw your attention to the fact that as soon as you go to the Wallaby Islands, actually named after these but spelt differently, you'll see on West Wallaby this rather large, handsome Tamil wallaby with quite a pronounced face stripe, and I'll draw your attention to its tail, which is quite long and thick, and the smaller form that occurs on East Wallaby. The wallabies that are on East Wallaby Island are decidedly smaller. They have no prominent facial stripe that runs right down onto the cheek, and the tails are considerably smaller. What is happening now is some work that has been done by the University of Sydney, and the Australian Museum has looked at the genetic profiles of those 2 populations and found them to be decidedly distinct. Not perhaps at the species level, but there is very little genetic similarity between the 2. There is very little morphological similarity between the 2, not only on size but on coloration. and on some shape differences. So again, we're finding, even in closely proximal islands, major differences occurring. And just to highlight that morphological difference, here is a close-up of the West Wallaby, Tamil Wallaby population. You can see the strong markings all the way down the tail, one of the decided giveaways. So the Tamil Wallabies are something that's being looked at not by the UWA Museum and Deck team, but by the University of Sydney. And it's starting to show that there are important differences between the populations on the two islands. Very briefly, to touch on the most important of the snakes out there is the carpet python. As I mentioned before, David Pearson has spent many, many trips working on this particular population. One of the slides I'm most enthused about is this ambush position of the carpet python. You can see curled up in a bush in an ambush position. Obviously in the background is the rear end of a fast-moving Tamil wallaby, which is one of its prey sources. The pythons on the wallaby groups do get quite large, principally because they not only feed on the rats and the lizards, but as they get bigger they can feed on the wallabies. So there is a very good food resource. And just to throw quickly into another picture, this is probably the last remaining specimen of the carpet python that occurs on East Wallaby. The populations used to be, never common, but used to be certainly on East Wallaby. Over the last few years, this specimen is one that Dave is holding, collected in 2005. Subsequent searches there have not found any, and I suspect that the population now, like the rats, are extinct on East Wallaby. And what I wanted to show is this is a rather spectacular little discovery that we made in our travels. This is a mating aggregation of pythons, and if you want to count the heads here, down a hole there's one just disappearing, there's a second head there, a third head coming into view here, a very large body that we'll pan back from, a fourth head, and as we pan back you'll get some idea of the massive size of the body in the foreground. And as we pan away to the right, there is a fifth head. When we finished actually taking all the stills and looking at, this was a mating aggregation of some 7 species of carpet python. Unfortunately, we didn't have the expert with us at that stage, but certainly a major female who'd recently fed. But whether the sexes of the other 6 were males, we don't really know. But in fact, you can see that there is a remarkable aggregation occurring during the mating period. And one of the interesting things while we're looking down on that, the stimulation of the little spine on the male near the cloaca was very actively working to stimulate the female. So it was all up a very exciting exercise to see this mating aggregation, not with complete mating occurring, but certainly stimulation. So biologists get excited by those things. Oh, I beg your pardon, we're going back the wrong way. To now go away from the pythons, where a lot of work has been published thanks to the intensive work, as I mentioned, by David Pearson at Deck. This is the work that Zoe Hamilton did for her honours at the University of Western Australia, and it's one of the reasons we got very excited in taking the work further by looking at other species. The animal on the left here is the typical spiny-tailed skink of the Abrolhos. That's Agonia stokesi, which I'm sorry you can't read too carefully. The one on the right is the typical spiny-tailed skink that occurs throughout the wheat belt. You can see somewhat different in pattern and colour. Then a dark form down here that's on the lower left, which is an island form on Borden Island. We won't worry about the name. And finally, a very new species which Zoe is about to describe called, well, we can't call it, but it's a new species about to be described on the basis of the work she did some 6 or 8 years ago. What is interesting about this is there's a lot of pattern variation, and there is a lot of morphological variation, and what Zoe wanted to look at was the genetic differentiation, which is probably a better cue to how separated the populations are. So as part of her honours project, she looked at the mitochondrial DNA, and very briefly she found that this beautiful black one that's undescribed is quite distinct from the others. She found the Abrolhos quite distinct from the ones on the mainland, and on the mainland and Borden Island there was an amalgamation which I think is still being sorted out. But what it does say to us is that there are 3 genetic groupings in a species that had all been called one. And so it now looks as though, very clearly, that the Abrolhos has its own species. The undescribed one, the black one from the granites on the mainland, is the most distinct, and there is still an interesting complex dealing with the Shark Bay forms. But what excites me is, in fact, that the Abrolhos ones are now endemic. In other words, it's a species that's only found on the Abrolhos. When we come in, and this is some recent work that Zoe's allowed me some access to, the morphology of the Abrolhos spiny-tailed skink, it occurs on the big islands on the Wallaby group. It occurs on two islands in the Pelsart group to the south. So it's been isolated from itself in the Abrolhos for quite some time, as well as from the mainland. It doesn't appear to have a lot of genetic separation, but there does appear to be some form of morphological separation. And this is a multi-dimensional plot, a plot of two of the principal coordinate axes to show that the blue and green squares are from the northern islands, and the red and yellow squares are more from the southern ones. And that's something which I'll come back to, because morphology is never a great indicator of speciation, because on islands there is different resource states, there are different selection pressures. But at least we can see that there are morphological differences between the south and the north. And we'll probably extend the molecular study to look in more detail at not just the mitochondrial DNA, but the nuclear DNA between these two quite distinct Abrolhos Island spiny-tailed skink populations. So that has been the stimulus to take a next step, and this is very much a work in progress, because once Zoe had found out that there were these differences occurring, we decided that we'd like to see how common it was across the whole spectrum of reptiles. In order to do that, we had to establish a reptile survey. These are the real workers. The non-worker is the one taking a photograph, establishing a pitfall trap. Pitfall fence line trap. For those of you not familiar with this technique, what we do is we dig a 20-litre bucket into the ground, and here we have a picture of a 20-litre bucket in the ground. A fence is run across it to, in effect, actually divert animals into the bucket. We find the next morning when we come around that in fact there is an excess of animals in the bottom of the pit trap. Here we have pictures of the spiny-tailed skink and the West Coast striped skink. And from that, we actually start to ascertain what species occur in what habitats and on what islands. But not all of the work is so labour intensive. Much of it up until the last 2 or 3 years has been relying on searching, and we've searched some 25 to 30 islands in the Abrolhos now to establish what populations of reptiles occur on which islands. And from that, we've been able to gain from taking small pieces of tail tip, a wonderful tissue bank which was going to be evaluated to look at the speciation events right across the archipelago. Very quickly, a smorgasbord of the types of reptiles. You can see there from the very small up on the right through to somewhat larger ones. The largest is the king skink, this rather handsome animal here, which can be anything up to 30 centimetres in body length alone, and it's a handsome tall skink. Those that burrow, those that crawl, those that climb. There are 25 species of reptile on the Abrolhos, of which I think about 22 are lizard species. So we have a very good remnant of the mainland out there on which to work on. The discoveries perhaps that are most exciting in the last 2 or 3 years, we've looked at these pitfall trapping techniques, and we've turned up a couple of species which were not known before. The beautiful ornate gecko, which is at this stage still regarded as the same as the population on the mainland, but one that we have to look at in detail. And there's also a few snakes that, come on, Chip, don't go backwards. Bear with me for a while. So there are species that we will need to look at in detail again. So what we already have on the Abrolhos are 3 endemic lizards for sure. The spiny-tailed skink, which was clearly shown that way through Zoe's honours. The western bearded dragon, which has its own subspecific nomenclature on the wallabies and North Island. And another new species which was turned up by active searching by our team only 2 years ago. It may look like a snake, but in fact it's a legless gecko, or we call them a legless lizard. That's a thing called a prasier or a worm lizard. And this is the first known example of that from the Abrolhos as well. Some new discoveries which are coming together. And I'll come back to that little fella because there has been some work done on it which again shows the highlight of how important the Abrolhos is. As zoologists, we're also very interested in what we call the type locality. In other words, the area where something was first discovered. The Abrolhos is the place of first discovery of three very important lizard species. The wonderful spiny tail gecko, which is all up and down the west coast. We have it here in Perth in some of the native bushlands, certainly all the way up to the Shark Bay area. The little bino-nosed gecko, a superbly difficult beast to understand. It's mainly parthenogenic, but it is known from this type locality on the Abrolhos from a male. Obviously parthenogenic populations are mainly female, and so the population on the Abrolhos is taking on huge significance. And we, in fact, of the 20 or 30 odd tissue specimens we have from the Abrolhos, we only have 2 males. So males do exist, and it's not a parthenogenetic population, but it will allow those that are interested in parthenogenesis and its evolution in Australia to do some very important work. And finally, another gecko that you may well be familiar with, the little marbled gecko, which occurs also in Perth, was first described from the Abrolhos. So these 3 widespread and important lizards are at their type locality in the Abrolhos, which means that everything we do as scientists will have to relate back to those populations. There are also 3 species of snake. I've touched on the carpet python, the subject of some very good publications now, and one that's well known, a blind snake, which you can just see the little dark pigments here. In fact, it is only useful to determining the difference between light and dark. And the west coast banded snake, Samoselaps, which in fact on the Abrolhos gets immeasurably larger than it does on the mainland. Again, it will be interesting to look at the genetic patterning of that. So having done a very preliminary sampling of reptiles with a view to getting some tissue to look at the genetics, the side that I'm particularly interested in is what can we learn about what species occur on what islands. And so I decided we'd put all the data together and look to see how different the islands were in the reptiles which occurred on them. What you do is you look to see how similar one island is to another by ranking the species side by side and creating a similarity index. You take that similarity index and do one of these wonderful things called a multi-dimensional scaling plot of it, and you end up with a hieroglyphic that looks a bit like that, but it does tell us something. First of all, the islands, which are only sand cays and made up of coral rubble, are all similar in the species they occur. And that's not surprising since they're fairly recent in origin. They weren't part of the mainland. They only get the tramp species on them, and so they can be expected to be different. The next group are all the islands which in fact are parts of the mainland but not very extensive in distribution. And in here we have islands both of the wallaby and of the Pelsart, the central and the southern groups. The third group is one that really comes out. It's North Island and Rat Island for 2 reasons. One, North Island is a big island which has been very poorly surveyed, and so we suspect that the assemblage there is not properly known. And Rat Island, as I've mentioned to you, is incredibly depauperate. It has been so destroyed by guano mining that it in fact probably holds only a fraction of the reptile population it once did. And finally, the 2 most significant islands in the Abrolhos are East and West Wallaby, these major islands with their dual formations on the Wallaby group, and they hold by far the richest assemblage and are by far the most important for the conservation of reptiles. We have the endemic spiny tail skink there, we have the ornate gecko there, we have the little worm lizard there, so you name it, and the Abrolhos take on a very significant component for the conservation of reptile fauna. I'm brazen enough to suggest that not only do we have good reptile fauna there, but I suspect when we start to look at the invertebrates, we'll find those equally as important on those large islands. Just quickly, I'll touch on the worm lizard again because I said it was a recent discovery. It got the herpetologists in our midst very excited. What we did was shipped off the tissue across to the eastern states, and they ran some very sophisticated molecular screening of it. As you can see, the West Wallaby, as it is misknown here, is quite distinct from what we thought it was, which is the West Coast form. The worm lizard that occurs mostly up and down the West Coast is Aprasia repens. This thing is quite distinct. And obviously it will probably become, well, it will become a species in its own right. And it's located again on a very small area of East Wallaby Island in the tall dunal systems where it resides at the base of these fairly dense acacia bushes. And it's in amongst the root structures there that this small worm lizard resides and hangs on. The other group, which is starting to show again the differences that occur, because we have decided that after a long period of time, this lovely sort of burrowing skink, as you can see the legs are much reduced, suggesting to us that it does spend a lot of time underground, is one of the sliders or laristas. It is known from Rat Island, it is known from the Wallaby Islands as well, but what we find in the most recent studies of the genetics of it, again you can see the Rat Island one highlighted in red here as being quite distinct. So when we start to build up our picture, we'll take not only the Rat Island specimens, but the ones on the Wallabies and the ones in the Pelsart group to the south, and really look to see if in fact we have the right nomenclature. Currently it's called Larista elegans, although defined originally as Larista distinguenda. It is certainly not that. It will become a different cluster or clade in this assemblage once we extend it. So the two outside studies from additional to the work we've done have suggested there's still a lot to learn about the identity of the reptiles on the wallabies. Very quickly, finally, to show morphological distinction, it is not unusual, as I mentioned before, to find that on any island you'll find a major change in the shape or the size of animals, because on each island its resource states are separate. This west coast striped skink, or Tenotus fallens, occurs on Rottnest. It occurs on many of the islands off the coast. Here on the Abrolhos, what I want to point out to you more than anything is that there is a remarkably good regression. On the larger islands, West Wallaby, these islands are decreasing in size as we go east. You find a decreasing size in the west coast fallens. That's measured by the length between the tip of the snout and the vent, or the same thing occurs in weight. So there's no great change in shape. They are lighter also. You may see here that this one little one out of the picture here is Rat Island. Again, I keep coming back to it. It has been vastly changed by guano mining. So what we see is that there's a strong correlation between size of the individuals in the population and island size. Again, not to be unexpected in a species such as that, but what we do see in the spiny tail skink is that this isn't the case. The same group of islands in decreasing size, we can see that it is quite higgledy-piggledy. We can see that some islands have very small populations of very small animals that weigh very little, and others have quite large ones, as you'd expect on West Wallaby. But some of the very small islands like Tatler, less than a hectare in extent, has quite large spiny tail skinks. A bit of a conundrum, but also probably explained by the fact that this skink is a broad-ranging feeder. It will eat vegetation as well as invertebrates, so it probably finds a far better food resource on islands than does the insect-feeding Tenotus fallens. So what has come from this for me is the fact that we now have a wonderful data set on which to start to explore the evolutionary patterns of reptiles on the Abrolhos Islands. We have a picture clearly coming to light that many of the species out there are their own entities. They are distinct from the mainland forms, which we've always assumed they were similar to, and we will certainly start to look at how different they are once we're able to get the molecular picture sorted. But why all of this in the first place? Well, it's heuristically interesting to me to get interested in reptiles because they are a fascinating group. But in fact, one of the things that is important in the Abrolhos is it's a very altered environment from some reasons, but it is not an island that has been subjected to massive tourism. One of the things that is about to occur is the creation of a major tourist precinct on the Wallaby group, and as such there are moves afoot to put hotel accommodation on some of the islands, which by the very nature of their fragility will impact on the populations that exist. This is a picture I come back to again of Rat Island. This is what an island looks like when it's completely stuffed after guano mining's finished. Again, the airport in the distance. This is Rat Island from the air, and you can see again that one of the joys of Rat Island is not only does it have development with people on it, it has in fact a very dense population of fishermen, and it is the site of the major government research organisation. The Fisheries Research Centre is on Rat Island. It also has its own airstrip, and it's central to the entire Abrolhos group. This island is not being considered for tourist development, but what is East Wallaby Island. An East Wallaby Island, you can see there, not clearly sadly, but the airstrip runs straight down the middle here. That's just the end of the airstrip. The one solitary building on the island is the reception centre, misnomered for a little campsite at the far end to get out of the sun. What is intended is that there's going to be a development, if it happens, a major tourist precinct put on East Wallaby. The second largest of all the islands, the only large island without any development whatsoever at this stage except for the airstrip. Certainly none of the fishermen have been allowed to develop there, and it's also home to 3 of the endemic species. So one of the things that will alter, doubtlessly, if development goes ahead, is the fragility of these islands. We already have an island which is completely altered by guano mining some 40 or 50 years ago, but what it seems is, in our penchant for wanting greater development, we're going to choose a more pristine island on which to develop it. So that is one of the issues that I hope to be involved in a debate as the time goes on. And the second is to say to you that not only thank you, but in fact one of the great attitudes for the Abrolhos is when you get a fine day, you can spend the evening with good colleagues and good friends and take wonderful photographs of, well, it's not going to come up, of sunsets, which in fact allow you to think that you've really done something useful. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.